The cabin sat at the edge of a quiet mountain valley, surrounded by towering pine trees and a crystal-clear lake that reflected the sky like polished glass. For most people, it looked like an ordinary vacation property. For me, it was something far more important. It was a piece of family history. My grandfather had purchased the land more than 40 years earlier, long before expensive homes and luxury developments appeared in the area. Back then, the valley was little more than wilderness and a handful of scattered cabins owned by families who wanted a place to escape city life. Over the years, the region changed. Developers arrived. Roads were widened. New homes appeared. Property values exploded. What had once been a hidden retreat slowly transformed into one of the most desirable locations in the county. Despite all those changes, our cabin remained exactly where it had always been. Simple, quiet, unpretentious. My grandfather loved it that way. After he passed away, ownership of the property transferred to me. The paperwork was straightforward. The land had been fully paid off decades earlier. There were no liens, no disputes, and no complications. The cabin belonged to me. At least that was what every legal document said. Unfortunately, legal documents meant very little to certain people, especially people who believed they controlled everything around them. The Homeowners Association had arrived years after my grandfather purchased the property. When a luxury subdivision was built nearby, the developers created an HOA to manage the new community. The association governed hundreds of homes. It controlled landscaping requirements, parking regulations, architectural standards, community amenities. But there was one important detail. Our cabin was never part of the HOA. The land existed outside its jurisdiction. The developers had tried to purchase my grandfather's property when construction began, but he refused every offer. As a result, the cabin remained an independent parcel surrounded by HOA-controlled neighborhoods. Most HOA board members accepted that reality. One person never did. The HOA president, Karen Mitchell. Over the years, Karen developed a reputation throughout the valley. Residents described her as controlling, argumentative, obsessed with authority. Many homeowners quietly complained about her behavior. Several had received fines for minor issues. Others faced endless complaints about harmless activities. Most simply paid the fines or complied with her demands because fighting the HOA was exhausting. Karen understood that. She relied on it. The more people gave in, the more powerful she felt. Unfortunately for her, my grandfather had never been intimidated by anyone. Whenever Karen attempted to involve herself in matters related to the cabin, he politely reminded her that she had no authority over the property. The conversations always ended the same way. Karen frustrated, my grandfather unmoved. After inheriting the cabin, I rarely visited during the first year. Work kept me busy, and the property mostly sat empty except for occasional maintenance trips. That changed one autumn. The leaves had begun turning gold and orange across the mountains. The weather was perfect. I decided to spend a long weekend at the cabin. The drive took several hours. As I approached the valley, memories flooded back. Fishing trips with my grandfather. Summer evenings around a fire. Snow-covered winters spent inside listening to stories. The cabin represented something that couldn't be measured in dollars. It represented family. That feeling stayed with me as I turned onto the private road leading toward the property. At first, everything seemed normal. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The lake shimmered in the distance. The cabin stood exactly as I remembered. But something felt different. Several new homes had appeared nearby. Large luxury homes, massive stone entrances, perfect landscaping. Everything looked carefully controlled, carefully managed, carefully monitored. I parked my truck beside the cabin and began unloading supplies. Within minutes, a black SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. The vehicle stopped abruptly. A woman stepped out. Even before she reached the property line, I recognized her. Karen. Time had not changed her. The confident posture remained. The expression of permanent disapproval remained. The sense of self-importance remained. She marched toward the cabin with obvious purpose. The moment she spotted my truck, her attention locked onto it, then onto me, then back onto the truck. Whatever assumptions she made happened almost instantly. She looked irritated before she even reached the driveway. For a moment, I considered simply ignoring her. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible. Karen had never been the type to leave quietly. She approached the property with the determination of someone preparing for a confrontation. Her arrival immediately transformed what should have been a peaceful weekend into something else entirely. What made the situation strange was the certainty visible on her face. She wasn't investigating. She wasn't asking questions. She already believed she knew exactly what was happening, and that confidence would soon become the foundation of a very serious mistake. As I continued unloading equipment, Karen surveyed the property like an inspector evaluating a crime scene. Her eyes moved across the truck, the trailer, the cabin, the surrounding land. Every glance seemed to reinforce whatever conclusion she had already reached. For several moments, she simply stood there observing. Then she began taking photographs, dozens of them. The truck, the driveway, the cabin exterior, the surrounding property. The behavior struck me as unusual, but not entirely surprising. Karen had built a reputation for documenting everything. Still, there was something different about this encounter, something more aggressive, more determined. It felt less like an HOA inspection and more like someone preparing a case. As the afternoon progressed, Karen remained nearby. She left briefly, returned, took more photographs, walked around the edge of the property, made several phone calls. Each action increased my suspicion that she was planning something. Yet I couldn't understand what. The property was legally mine. The cabin was maintained. The taxes were current. There was no legitimate issue she could raise. And yet Karen acted like she had discovered a major violation. The sun slowly began sinking behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the valley. The peaceful atmosphere that normally defined the area had disappeared. In its place was a growing sense of tension, a feeling that this visit was heading toward a confrontation neither of us could avoid. As darkness approached, Karen finally drove away. But something told me the situation wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only beginning. Inside the cabin, I organized supplies and prepared for the evening. Yet my attention kept returning to the driveway outside, to the strange behavior, to the photographs, to the certainty in Karen's expression. Most of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing her next move. And by the following morning, that suspicion would prove correct. The following morning began with the kind of peace that made the cabin special. A thin layer of fog hovered above the lake. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees, casting long golden beams across the property. Birds moved through the forest canopy, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant water. For a few moments, it felt as though the previous day's encounter had been nothing more than an annoyance. I made coffee, stepped onto the porch, and looked out across the valley. The view was exactly as my grandfather had loved it, unspoiled, quiet, timeless. That calm lasted less than an hour. The first sign of trouble came when multiple vehicles appeared on the private road leading toward the cabin. 2 SUVs arrived first. A pickup truck followed behind them, then another vehicle. Instead of continuing past the property, they stopped directly in front of the driveway. Doors opened. Several people stepped out. Karen was among them. Unlike the previous day, she wasn't alone. She had brought members of the HOA board, a property management representative, and several curious residents who appeared eager to witness whatever confrontation she had planned. The group gathered near the entrance of the property while Karen pointed toward the cabin and gestured dramatically. Even from a distance, her body language suggested complete confidence. She acted like someone who believed victory was already guaranteed. The gathering quickly attracted attention. Nearby homeowners emerged from their houses. Some stood on porches. Others watched from driveways. Word spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Within minutes, a small audience had formed. People sensed something unusual was happening. Karen seemed pleased by the attention. Over the years, she had developed a habit of turning disputes into public spectacles. The larger the audience, the more authority she appeared to have. The more authority she appeared to have, the more likely people were to comply. For many residents, that strategy worked. Unfortunately for Karen, this situation wasn't what she thought it was. She eventually led the group toward the cabin. Several board members carried folders. One carried a clipboard. Another held a tablet filled with documents. The entire scene resembled an official inspection. The problem was that they had no legal authority to conduct one. As they approached, Karen's confidence only seemed to grow. She surveyed the property as though she already owned it. The board members followed her lead. A few glanced around awkwardly, perhaps unsure why they were there. Others appeared convinced that some major violation had occurred. Karen had likely spent the previous evening persuading them that immediate action was necessary. Years of leadership had given her significant influence within the association. Most people simply trusted whatever information she provided. That trust would soon create a very embarrassing situation. The group stopped near the driveway. Karen examined the truck again. She studied the trailer. She looked toward the cabin. Then she began reviewing paperwork with several board members. The process continued for nearly 20 minutes. They pointed at maps, compared documents, made notes. Every action reinforced the impression that they believed they were building an airtight case. Meanwhile, nearby residents continued watching. Some appeared entertained. Others looked uncomfortable. A few exchanged skeptical glances. Several long-time locals recognized the cabin. Many knew its history. Some had known my grandfather personally. Those residents seemed particularly confused by Karen's actions. They understood something Karen either didn't know or chose to ignore. The property had existed long before the HOA. As the morning continued, the gathering grew larger. People sensed drama, and HOA drama always attracted attention, especially when Karen was involved. Eventually, additional vehicles arrived. One belonged to a local contractor. Another belonged to a landscaping company frequently hired by the HOA. The sight immediately raised concerns. Why would contractors be attending what was supposedly an inspection? The answer became increasingly obvious. Karen wasn't simply planning to issue warnings. She was preparing to take action. The realization transformed mild concern into genuine alarm. The possibility that she intended to interfere with private property seemed absurd. Yet every sign pointed in that direction. Several contractors walked around the perimeter of the driveway. Others examined access points. One reviewed measurements. The activity resembled preparation for a project. Not an inspection, not a discussion. A project. As more pieces fell into place, a troubling picture emerged. Karen appeared convinced that the cabin property had somehow become subject to HOA control. Whether she genuinely believed it or had convinced herself through years of frustration remained unclear. But her behavior suggested she was acting on that assumption. And she was moving quickly, very quickly. The most surprising part was how little verification seemed to have occurred. No one appeared interested in reviewing county records. No one appeared interested in confirming property boundaries. No one appeared interested in speaking with the actual owner. Instead, they were operating entirely on Karen's interpretation of events. That interpretation was about to collide with reality. Around midday, another development occurred. Several temporary signs appeared near the entrance road. Bright signs, official-looking signs. Signs declaring that unauthorized vehicles would be removed. Signs referencing HOA authority. Signs warning of penalties. The irony was almost unbelievable. The signs stood near land the HOA did not control. Yet Karen displayed them as though the matter had already been decided. Some residents began taking photographs. Others quietly discussed what they were witnessing. Questions started spreading through the crowd. Not everyone supported Karen. In fact, many people had grown tired of her increasingly aggressive tactics. For years, they had tolerated her behavior because challenging the HOA required time and money. Now they were watching her target property that wasn't even part of the association. The situation felt different, riskier, more extreme. Karen either didn't notice the growing skepticism or didn't care. Her focus remained fixed on the cabin. By mid-afternoon, she appeared more confident than ever. Whatever documentation she believed supported her position seemed to have convinced her completely. The board members appeared equally invested. The atmosphere had transformed from curiosity into expectation. Everyone sensed a major confrontation approaching. No one knew exactly how it would unfold, but it was obvious something significant was about to happen. As clouds rolled across the mountains, the mood shifted again. A feeling of inevitability settled over the valley. The audience continued growing. Residents whispered among themselves. Vehicles lined portions of the road. People waited, watched, speculated. Then, shortly after 3 o'clock, Karen made her move. With the board members gathered behind her and dozens of residents observing from a distance, she headed directly toward the cabin once again. This time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, no attempt to gather information. She moved with the confidence of someone preparing to enforce authority. The problem was that the authority she believed she possessed didn't actually exist. And before the day was over, that mistake would attract the attention of someone far more powerful than an HOA president. Someone whose arrival would change everything. Someone wearing a sheriff's badge. By the time Karen approached the cabin that afternoon, nearly everyone in the surrounding neighborhood knew something unusual was happening. Residents stood along the road. Families watched from porches. Some people sat in lawn chairs as though they were attending a community event. The valley had become the stage for a confrontation that many suspected would end badly. The only question was who would be embarrassed when it was over. Karen clearly believed it would not be her. She walked toward the cabin with absolute confidence, followed by several HOA board members and the property manager. The crowd watched carefully as she stopped near the driveway and began organizing documents. Everything about her posture suggested authority. Everything about her expression suggested certainty. She looked like someone preparing to enforce a decision that had already been made. What she didn't realize was that every assumption supporting that decision was wrong. For years, Karen had viewed the cabin as an obstacle. The property sat in the middle of land she believed should have been under HOA control. It represented the one thing she couldn't regulate, the one thing she couldn't fine, the one thing she couldn't manage. Instead of accepting that reality, she had spent years convincing herself that eventually she would find a way to bring the property under HOA authority. Somewhere along the way, frustration had transformed into obsession. And obsession had transformed into overconfidence. That overconfidence was now leading her directly into a disaster of her own making. As the gathering continued, several longtime residents exchanged concerned looks. Many had watched Karen push boundaries before, but this situation felt different. This wasn't a disagreement about landscaping or parking regulations. This involved private property rights. The consequences could be serious, yet Karen appeared completely unaware of the danger. She continued reviewing paperwork while the board members stood nearby. Some looked nervous. Others appeared confused. A few seemed to be realizing that they might have trusted the wrong information. The atmosphere changed dramatically when another vehicle entered the area. A marked sheriff's patrol unit slowly turned onto the road. Conversations stopped immediately. Heads turned. The crowd became silent. The sheriff's vehicle moved steadily forward before stopping near the entrance of the property. The deputy stepped out and began assessing the scene. A second patrol vehicle arrived only moments later. The arrival of law enforcement instantly shifted the balance of power. For the first time all day, uncertainty appeared on Karen's face. It lasted only a moment. Then her confidence returned. She appeared convinced that the deputies had arrived to support her position. Several people in the crowd seemed to reach the same conclusion. After all, Karen had spent years presenting herself as the authority figure in the community. Many residents had grown accustomed to seeing her get her way. But county law operates differently than HOA politics. Facts matter. Records matter. Ownership matters. And none of those things were on Karen's side. The deputies began speaking with various individuals. They reviewed documents. They examined maps. They listened carefully. Most importantly, they checked county property records. The process took time. The crowd waited patiently. Karen appeared increasingly restless. She repeatedly pointed toward the cabin, toward the truck, toward the property boundaries. She clearly expected validation. Instead, the deputies continued reviewing information. As the minutes passed, the outcome became obvious to anyone paying attention. The deputies weren't finding evidence supporting Karen's claims. They were finding evidence supporting mine. Because the truth was simple. The property belonged to me. It had always been independent. It had never joined the HOA. It had never signed any HOA agreements. It had never surrendered any property rights. And county records clearly reflected that reality. Eventually, one deputy retrieved a detailed parcel map from the patrol vehicle. The map showed every property boundary in the area. The document left no room for interpretation. The cabin sat entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. Not partially, not conditionally, entirely. The realization spread through the crowd almost immediately. Whispers began moving from person to person. People studied the map. Some shook their heads. Others laughed quietly. Several residents appeared genuinely shocked that Karen had allowed the situation to escalate this far without verifying basic property records. The board members looked particularly uncomfortable. Many had trusted Karen's assessment. Now they were learning that they had participated in an enforcement action against property they had no authority over. The embarrassment was impossible to hide. Karen's confidence began disappearing. The transformation happened gradually. First came confusion, then disbelief, then the unmistakable realization that the situation was collapsing around her. The deputies continued their investigation. What they discovered made matters even worse. The temporary signs placed near the property had no legal basis. The threats regarding vehicle removal had no authority behind them. The contractors brought to the scene had been prepared for work that the HOA had no right to authorize. Every step Karen had taken that day rested on a false assumption, and every step increased her exposure to potential legal consequences. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. The woman who had arrived expecting to demonstrate authority now found herself answering uncomfortable questions. The same residents who once feared challenging her now watched as reality dismantled her claims piece by piece. For years, Karen had relied on intimidation. She had relied on people surrendering rather than fighting. She had relied on the assumption that nobody would challenge her interpretation of the rules. That strategy finally failed. Not because someone argued louder, not because someone became more aggressive, but because facts are difficult to intimidate. Property records don't care about confidence. County maps don't care about assumptions. Ownership doesn't disappear because someone wishes it would. The deputies eventually completed their review. Their conclusion was clear. The cabin property belonged to me. The HOA had no authority over it. The enforcement actions had no legal foundation. The matter was settled. Just like that. Years of Karen's frustration came crashing down in front of dozens of witnesses. For a long moment she stood silently near the driveway. The crowd watched. The board members watched. The deputies watched. Nobody said anything. Nothing needed to be said. The outcome spoke for itself. The woman who had spent years trying to control the property had finally encountered a boundary she couldn't cross, and everyone had witnessed it. As the afternoon came to an end, people slowly began leaving. Residents returned to their homes. Vehicles departed. The contractors packed up their equipment. The temporary signs were removed. The crowd disappeared almost as quickly as it had formed. Only the cabin remained, exactly where it had always been. Exactly as it had always been. The board members eventually distanced themselves from the incident. Several resigned within the following months. Others pushed for changes in HOA leadership and oversight procedures. The controversy became one of the most discussed events in the community's history. Karen's reputation never recovered. The authority she had spent years building disappeared almost overnight. People who once feared her began questioning her decisions. Others demanded transparency. Some openly challenged actions they previously would have accepted without resistance. The culture of the HOA slowly changed. As for the cabin, it became more meaningful than ever. Not because of the confrontation, not because of the victory, but because the experience reinforced something my grandfather had always believed. Rights only matter when people are willing to defend them. Months later, I returned to the property once again. The lake was calm. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The mountains stood silently in the distance. Everything felt peaceful, the way it should be, the way my grandfather remembered it, the way I hoped future generations would remember it too. And as I sat on the porch watching the sunset over the valley, one thought remained impossible to ignore. Karen had spent years trying to claim control over the cabin. In the end, all she accomplished was proving exactly why she never had any control in the first place. The cabin remained standing, the property remained protected, and the truth remained exactly where it had always been, written in the records, defended by the law, and stronger than any HOA president's opinion could ever be. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more HOA, Karen, and property rights stories where the truth always wins.